What's up, guys? Today we're going to talk about how we think and how we as humans in our environment interact so we can help ourselves, A, be prepared to make better decisions, and B, better understand what our decisions lead to and what actions led to a certain result and how we can optimize those. So while this is going to be related to, say, training, it can probably be extrapolated to other areas beyond just that of training. So let's talk about the general aspect of it first. So how we think. So again, general terms. We have our brain right here. Here's our brain hanging out. And we come across an obstacle. So we have to get over something. We're in a unique environment. And we need to find a way to overcome a specific challenge. Now what happens is the brain has access to all this information that it has previously worked with before. So information 1, information 2, information 3. And based on that collection of information and its relation to the current obstacle, you might make a specific decision. You might say, well, I'm going to take X, Y, and Z as my specific actions, and we're going to do our best to overcome this obstacle. Now what happens is your brain has a prediction, as to what's going to happen based on the actions it takes to get over this obstacle. So it goes, okay, well, if I do this, I expect X, Y, and Z to take place. And so you can think about is you have the perfect outcome, that's this red dot here. And in a perfect world, that is what your action would lead to. But more times than not, we're not really perfect. And so we might say our action leads us over here to the right of what we expected, or maybe it's above it. The point is, it's not exactly to the point that we expected it to be, right? We're not necessarily directly on point. We are a certain distance if you decide to do an X, Y coordinate. Let's see how far away we are from this distance here. You could understand, okay, I am this far off from what I expected. Now what happens is your brain gets to understand this information. It takes in this distance, these X, Y coordinates, and it says, okay, well, what happened? Right, why wasn't my action expected? And then it takes it and then it kind of learns from its environment. And then next time it encounters a situation, it might try to get closer and closer to where these two match up to have an expected outcome. So that's kind of how we like to think. We have forward predictions and feedback predictions. A really easy example of this, even in human movement, can be the example of picking up a teapot. You might think the teapot is full of water and you go to pick it up and it's not full of water. So you apply too much force right away, you lift it up really quick, but now you've learned. So next time you go, okay, I know how much water is in that teapot or how much water isn't in it, so I pick it up and appropriately lift the amount of force I should. Same thing happens all the time when people think there's another step and they don't take the step. The idea is we look to collect information in our environment, either through action and outcome. So we do something to overcome an obstacle and we try to make it better, or we have a better predictive model. So our initial action is better. So let's think about that for a second. Our brain, as we've kind of realized here, has two different means through which it can interact. Let's get rid of this here. It goes, okay, cool. We can either better think about how our initial action is. So action number 1. And that is the first one. I encounter an obstacle. All of my inputs go into this. Past experiences, things I've learned. We have an outcome. And then we reflect on it. And that's where process number 2 is our reflection. Now we could take this same model, knowing there's 2 steps in this really simplistic model, we're kind of looking at, again, a little overly simplified, but we can apply it to how we learn in strength and conditioning and training and research and exercise science, whatever it might be, business, all this is kind of universally applicable. But we're going to stick to strength conditioning here first and better understand how we can optimize this. So because we have 2 pathways, one is, I call it the feed forward, and 2 is the feedback, right? Your initial prediction. What goes into number 1? Well, that's things like research, Then you've learned from others, so other experiences from other people or other things you've been into, information. It's all the pieces that go into making a plan, right? And making a plan for this outcome. So it's like, okay, cool. I'm an experienced football player. I know when the defense does something like this, my offense should do, as I poorly draw a football field rapidly here, something like this, and we're going to go block and we're going to run, a fake screen and have a go route on this side, whatever it might be. So you have a game plan based on your previous exposure. So we can make our ability to make initial decisions better. So let's think about that in terms of training. Well, I get a new client. I need to understand that client and some of their goals. So then I look at, okay, what's their assessment? What assessments can I do? What's the best assessments I can pick? What are their goals and what actions can I do to get them closer to their goals? So things like exercises and general programming, right? And then how does the research say I should program? What are the research best practices? Maybe this certification that I got over here. But all that goes into this first bit of information. A lot of times that's where we stop. And now it's great to have this bit of information because we can find ways to optimize. If we know number one exists and this is our feed forward model, our initial action, we can do things to constantly refine our ability to make better initial actions. But the thing is, number two that we have here, and I'm going to put it in the middle, is based on feedback. So this is a feedback. And what's key about feedback is that we need to have feedback in the first place to understand. So was it effective? Was my number one, how did it affect number two? Did I get better? Did I get worse? So this is where you start to measure things like your goals. Are you progressing in the direction you expect to? Are you moving in the right way? Are you making the progress that you think you're actually making? So number one is how we collect feedback. So we'll say feedback collection, because that helps and guides the feedback interpretation. So that's how we interpret our feedback is going to be heavily dependent on what kind of information we're collecting. All of this still being under category number two. And so we can think about this in terms of training. What are tests I can use that I think are beneficial? And then how do I interpret these tests? And this interpretation, again, has some has some parallels to number one, because things that help us interpret this information are things like research and what we've learned, what others have learned, and what we know from them. And then there's things like personal experience, anecdotes, your previous experience with this kind of feedback, the information you're collecting, the test you're doing. So let's give a really simple example. We have an athlete number one. An athlete wants to jump higher. Cool. So I build a program based on all my understanding, a program of how this athlete can jump higher. Now what happens is I need feedback as to whether or not this person, my action number one, is leading to an increase in jump height. Great. Is it? Well, let's look at the test, our feedback, right? Let's look at our feedback here. We'll keep this in terms here, feedback. And are they getting better? Right? Is their jump height progressing how I expect it to? And if not, what interventions can I then apply back over here to make this outcome better? And you notice this becomes a loop of information where we begin to optimize how we train and how we perform. Now, this simple feedback loop is how us humans operate in the environment. It's how we work in the environment. I go in a situation, I think, like a job interview. The first time you do a job interview, you're probably not very good at it. You probably stutter, you probably get nervous and anxious, you say the wrong things, you might not get a job. Now, the next time you go to a job interview, you learn from that outcome. You learned that maybe I should do X, Y, and Z a little better. Maybe I should make my resume better. Maybe I should do whatever it might be better. And so now the result might be different and me get an outcome of a job that I didn't get last time. But when we train, we often don't think about part number two. We also don't stratify these two and make the distinction between one, our initial assessment, our initial actions, our initial feed forward, because we can optimize that through better understanding of research and science. And number two, how we can interpret that feedback information and how we can make that information help us, work for us, so we become better at number one. And so that's why it's so important to learn how we learn, so we can learn in ways that help us optimize what we're trying to accomplish. So hopefully that makes sense. It all starts with, again, your brain, your want to learn, you trying to learn, but then once we actually start to acquire that information, but we understand the actions within the environment, that be business, training, I don't care what it is, a job interview, and how we can optimize it. Again, in this case, we just talked about training and how we can have really important to understand our initial first model, our prediction. Number two, how far off was our prediction. Number three, I guess, which goes under number two, is 2A, I'd call it, our feedback. What's our feedback, how we interpret it, how we assess it, and how we can then make adjustments going forward. So I hope you guys enjoy. If you have comments or questions, let me know, and I appreciate